off, it's actually creating a massive problem.
Brazil and the United States are currently experiencing strained relations.
America's farmers, already feeling the pinch, are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
Well, soybean farmers in the U.S. continue to hang on for dear life.
Once unshakable deals abruptly fell through, leaving grain-filled ships adrift on the water. In just one season, 7 of America's most reliable agricultural allies abandoned the United States in favor of Canada's maize supply. The stakes go well beyond commerce. Its cuisine was successful. Dinner tables, stables running out of fodder, and rural towns losing their ability to survive. Canada's dependability and advancement are luring nations to the country. And the magnitude of this pivotal moment becomes evident when the entire list is revealed. South Korea is number 7. The South Korean limitations of an antiquated American supply chain were exposed by transformation. Food processors expected agriculture to operate as efficiently as the electronics they manufacture in a nation where speed and accuracy are essential to every business. High-quality maize was not enough to secure contracts. They insisted on perfect traceability. Buyers from South Korea desired rapid access to digital documents, blockchain verification, and real-time tracking from their workplaces. However, American corn frequently arrived covered in documentation that provided information about the moisture content, harvest dates, and soil conditions. But Canadian exports arrived with QR codes that it seemed to belong in another century. The simplicity of the breaking point was almost embarrassing. For almost 3 weeks, a shipment of American maize remained unopened in the busy port of Bisusun. Because the records were dispersed over several systems, officials found it difficult to confirm their origin. Some handwritten, while some need confirmation over the phone. After the grain had left American land, the tracking system had stopped working. While inspectors pieced together the identity of the maize like detectives going through an ancient archive, South Korean producers watched as production lines stalled. The corn was great in and of itself, but demonstrating it was a frustrating effort. A Canadian container that was docked next to it that same week was checked and cleared in less than 48 hours. Every kernel's travel was digitally recorded, and each one could be tracked back to its own farm. South Korean businesses rapidly realized the true offerings of Canadian vendors. Certainty, not merely grain. Because of the smooth technology integration offered by Canadian exporters, firms were able to precisely manage their schedules down to the hour. The food business of Samsung was entrusted with obtaining 200,000 tons for a new facility. Manitoba was immediately given the contract. Every specification was measured to the nearest decimal place, and delivery dates were fulfilled in hours rather than days. When South Korea implemented more stringent traceability regulations, requiring suppliers to demonstrate the precise path of materials from farm to factory. Equipped with blockchain technologies that easily complied with the requirements, Canadian exporters were already ready. Meanwhile, American suppliers struggled with record-keeping that had not yet transitioned to the digital age as they rushed to modernize. Customers increased the pressure by requesting information on the origins of their food and how it was created. American suppliers were unable to immediately meet that demand, but Canadian exporters were able to. South Korea's maize supply chain was entirely reconstructed on Canadian partnerships in less than 2 years. The outcomes were striking. A 67% reduction in paperwork delays, a 34% increase in processing speed, and 0 disturbances throughout the chain. Korean manufacturers lowered their inventory buffers as a result of the significant increase in efficiency. As South Korean technology companies started funding Canadian agricultural innovation and advancing initiatives in next-generation farming equipment, the cooperation grew stronger. Canadian Agrich investment increased by more than 300%, securing a long-term partnership between the two countries. The loss was heartbreaking for U.S. exporters. The understanding that America's agricultural system could no longer meet the demands of a digital age was what had pushed South Korea away, not politics or animosity. Dependability was no longer sufficient. Suppliers have to be intelligent, transparent, and connected in order to thrive. The future was written in Canadian grain, and South Korea made that decision. Egypt is number 6. Egypt's decision was based on trust, but South Korea's was based on technology. Over 30 years ago, Egyptian mills had depended on consistent shipment from Iowa and Illinois. More than 100 million people were fed by American corn-filled bread ovens, which also fueled the livestock sector that supplied markets all throughout the country. Consistency, a bond that seemed impervious to change, was the foundation of the partnership. However, late at night, doubts grew in the corridors of Cairo's food security departments. It began with doubt. Contracts were ripped apart in a matter of days, and trade conflicts broke out without warning. Reversals of the midnight policy became commonplace, and Washington could send a single tweet that could whirl markets into turmoil. Officials in Egypt became more and more concerned. They pondered what would happen if grain ships were stuck in the Suez Canal due to tariffs that were applied in the middle of the voyage. They inquired as to whether fresh penalties may abruptly render their shipments unlawful, severing a vital link that supplied 2/3 of their corn supply. The tipping point occurred when a shipment was delayed for 2 weeks at the port due to a complex set of additional documentation requirements that appeared to be more political than useful. The fact that bakeries in Cairo started limiting flour while the corn lay idle is evidence that food security can suddenly collapse. At that point, a different offer started to be heard by Egyptian purchasers. The Canadian representatives did not show up promising inexpensive pricing or making sweeping statements. Rather, they provided stability. 5-year contracts were guaranteed, delivery dates were set, and quality requirements were guaranteed rather being subject to negotiation. The initial supply from Canada was little, 50,000 tons as a test run. It was delivered on schedule, with perfect documentation and specifications that were so accurate that mill operators in Egypt reported a 12% increase in output efficiency. The consistency was indisputable, waste decreased, and machinery operated more smoothly. Egypt secured a 5-year contract worth about $1 billion a year in just 18 months. Multiple shipping routes, emergency preparations, and built-in assurances that no political event could interfere were all part of the agreement. Saudi Arabia is number 5. The change in Saudi Arabia was both urgent and strategic. Over 80% of the food in the Desert Kingdom is imported, and to keep shelves stocked for decades, it mostly depended on American systems. On paper, having suppliers from other countries gave it a diverse appearance. However, upon closer examination, almost all of the routes continued to pass through American-controlled channels, making the nation susceptible to changes in U.S. policy. Saudi strategists used war gaming scenarios to test their system, and the outcomes were frightening. In just a few weeks, a single decision in Washington may lead to shortages throughout the kingdom. It was obvious. When it came to food, the country that dominated the world's oil markets was in a precarious position. When a regular cargo was delayed by 10 days due to new security checks, it reached a breaking point. More of a political gesture than a thorough examination. As their lifeline became enmeshed in irrelevant conflicts, Saudi authorities watched in irritation. At that point, their focus changed. Towards the north, America was no longer able to provide what Canada did. Total autonomy. American banks, ports, and diplomatic demands were all circumvented by Canadian supplies. Silently, the monarchy secured 400,000 tons by signing its first agriculture pact of Canadian wheat, canola, and corn per year. With fixed prices, assured delivery, and provisions guaranteeing no political meddling, the terms were straightforward. Canadian companies collaborate closely with Saudi food security planners to create emergency supply networks, redundant shipping routes, and collaborative partnerships in desert agriculture. Sustainable agriculture. The relationship expanded to include precision agriculture, climate-controlled storage, and advanced irrigation. In just 3 years, Canada provided 2/3 of Saudi Arabia's grain imports, and the kingdom made billions of dollars in agricultural infrastructure investments in Canada, solidifying the partnership for good. Vietnam is number 4. With just 12 words, Vietnam's biggest feed maker informed its longtime American supplier that it would be moving to Canada with immediate effect. I appreciate everything. Southeast Asia's whole grain trade would be upended by that silent warning. This choice was not made in a boardroom of a corporation or in a government office. It was demonstrated in the Mekong Delta, where American political cycles had long held rice fields and fish ranches captive. Washington's relationship with Beijing flares up every time. Each and every tariff or punishment resulted in delayed delivery and increased feed expenses for Vietnamese farmers. The price of maize skyrocketed, shipments halted, and everyday life became characterized by unpredictability. Operating costs for farmers who raised fish and prawns for export markets fluctuated wildly from month to month, making it practically impossible to establish breeding schedules or negotiate contracts abroad. Delays and price fluctuations were only one aspect of the hidden costs associated with American grain. Vietnamese exporters discovered that their seafood products were involved in unrelated issues as trade disagreements between Washington and other nations intensified, and that inputs as basic as maize were bringing a whole economy down. At that point, a comprehensive analysis of the nation's supply chain dependencies was initiated by agricultural officials. The results were striking. Almost 4 out of every 5 agricultural imports were either made in the U.S. or passed via U.S.-controlled systems. In reality, a single political decision from a government thousands of miles away may cut off 97 million people's access to food. Vietnam's imports of maize changed from being roughly 80% American to being nearly 90% Canadian by 2025. Canadian businesses made further investments to construct research facilities in Vietnam and developing tropical climate-appropriate, sustainable farming practices. The connection was strengthened by providing scholarships for Vietnamese students to study agriculture in Canada. The defection of Vietnam caused no repercussions. The force of the tidal surge would be felt much beyond Southeast Asia. Japan comes in third. The story unfolded differently in Japan. For American agriculture, however, the conclusion was equally devastating. Traders in the financial area of Tokyo saw something that had not occurred in 60 years. The proportion of U.S. maize import states were now less than half of the entire volume. This was a purposeful disassembly executed with the accuracy and discipline that characterized Japanese manufacturing, rather than a slow deterioration. The crack started in labs where Japanese producers examined arriving American grain and discovered alarming irregularities. Protein content varied, moisture levels fluctuated erratically, and quality control was failing. These deviations were more than troublesome for an economy where entire production lines rely on perfect inputs. They were unacceptable. Entire production lines could be stopped by a 2% variation in moisture, upset delivery timelines, and harm Japan's standing as a flawless country in international markets. The transformation was sealed by regulatory amendments. With blockchain-based tracking systems, Canadian suppliers were prepared for Japan's new regulations demanding traceability for imported ingredients, which made compliance easy. Exporters from the United States rushed to catch up. However, the distance had already grown. Two-thirds of Japan's maize imports were controlled by Canadian companies in just 4 years. The partnership grew to include 10-year exclusive supply contracts, collaborative businesses, and cooperative research. It was more than just a lost market for American exporters. The fact that the new partner was Canadian was evidence that Japan had discovered a better fit for its precision economy. China is number 2. However, the earthquake that occurred in Beijing eclipsed the shock that came from Japan. Within an aircraft office complex, China's the Agricultural Development Committee looked at its weaknesses in terms of food security and came to a decision that would change the balance of power in the world. China's food supply was at risk due to decisions taken in Washington, even though it had suppliers from many different countries. One new tariff, one sanction, and one policy change might endanger more than 1 billion people's diets. This was unacceptable for an emerging superpower. China needed a partner that could deliver large quantities, ensure reliability, and function completely outside of American political sway. The solution was Canada. It was a huge initial accord. Over 18 months, over 2 million tons of canola, wheat, and maize were produced. But it was more than just volume. Bypassing American-controlled infrastructure entirely, Canadian grain could travel through Canadian banks and Arctic shipping lanes without any intervention from the U.S. Mexico is the first. A betrayal that went deeper than any loss across oceans was then dealt by the closest neighbor of all. Mexico had been America's most reliable agricultural consumer for over 70 years. Grain crossed the border with such ease that it rarely appeared. In negotiations, American corn was vital to Mexican food processors, animal ranches, and tortilla makers.